Okay, what I'd like to do is to show you what really two rival economic systems are, capitalism and socialism, um, how the Industrial Revolution is going to impact them, and why they are really evolutions of the Industrial Revolution. So, first of all, capitalism is a system where businesses and basically private individuals own resources and are able to start businesses. They try and sell whatever products it is that they make on a market, and they grow as they do better. So, successful businesses basically use their profits as capital to invest in better technology and practices, and then that leads to more products. Industrial capitalism is basically doing all this, but with machines, and those machines allow you to produce on massive scales. So essentially, resources are used by private companies to produce things, which are then sold back to people. Um, Capitalism, in a lot of ways, is built for growth. It's inherently, in a lot of ways, not meant to be in balance with the resources that it has. So, because capitalism is essentially built to grow, it's also essentially built to consume resources. So, here we have something called a positive feedback loop. The green box is the initial money that's used by a company. That money becomes a capital investment or a bunch of money that's used to invest. It's used to invest in things that will make production better, like better machines, better technology, better infrastructure. That allows the company to produce more cheaply. That leads to more profits. And then that's going to lead to more investment, which they can use to increase their, um, basically, they can use that to make even better machines, better technology. So once you have money, you're able to make money more easily. So the first bit of money is used to better your company. And by bettering your company, you can make more money. And then you use more of that money to better your company even more. So that's why we call this a positive feedback loop. Essentially, it's a loop that makes your company better and better and better. Um, Now, what I want to do is introduce you to a thinker named Adam Smith. Adam Smith is, in many ways, kind of one of, if not the most important thinker in the development of capitalism. And Adam Smith basically thought that if everyone looked out for their own interests, then supply and demand would basically function like something called an invisible hand. It would fix problems in society and it would create innovations that society needed. Um, Essentially, the idea was that if everybody looked out for themselves, everybody is only going to buy things that they need. People are only going to produce and do things for their customers that benefit their customers because their customers won't buy from them if they take advantage of them. And so Adam Smith essentially said that all we have to do is look out for our own interests and everything will be okay. In many ways, Adam Smith was a pretty progressive person, and he essentially thought that people would be able to better themselves if they looked out for their own interests. Um, Now, what he argued for was something called laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire is French, and it means leave it alone. And this form of capitalism was basically the idea that government shouldn't do anything to interfere with businesses. Um, or at least it shouldn't do anything to interfere with businesses badly. So its ultimate goal was to make businesses competitive. And this idea of laissez-faire capitalism meant that companies, because of that positive feedback loop, were essentially free to grow as much as they wanted, right? So if government is not stepping in, then companies kind of run rampant, and companies are able to do whatever they need to grow. Now, there's something that's going to happen to workers at the same time. This is called a negative feedback loop. So essentially, we start with the manufacturer getting capital investment, getting money, and they hire workers. And the worker works, and the worker gets paid, but the worker gets paid low wages because the company is trying to keep its production costs low. The worker has to work and it has to consume the products to survive. So that means it's paying the companies essentially to get things that it needs to survive. That leads to more money for the manufacturer, who can buy technology, which essentially makes the worker less and less valuable. And so the manufacturers, meanwhile, are kind of in what you might call like a race to the bottom, where they are competing to see how little they can pay workers while still make money. Not all companies did this. Adam Smith would argue that this is not what companies should do. They should treat their workers better, because then the workers will buy from them. But at the same time, this isn't the reality. People generally are trying to make as much money as they can, and very often the workers did not get a fair wage. So a negative feedback loop is where the worker is essentially getting paid less than they need to survive, and yet the company is doing better. So in an industrial system, workers basically become like machine parts. There's something known as division of labor, where workers were assigned small little pieces of the manufacturing process. Each person has a small little piece, and their specialization is basically whatever management tells them to. And it's just not geared towards what the worker is necessarily good at. It's geared toward the worker doing a certain job and the company moving forward in their production process. What this does is people, they need wages, and they need this for food, because in an industrial system, people work for wages which they use to buy food. This also means that, for instance, women have to go work, and sometimes children have to go work just to make enough money for the family to survive. This wasn't really the case in an agricultural society, so this is another change. For instance, I have some photos here of, most of them are in industrial United States. You have children who are working in factories. You have children working often in dangerous parts of factories. You have people working really, really late at night, so there are lights on, and they're working in an industrial piping factory, or a glass factory, excuse me. And you have even people working just to make ends meet. And so essentially what happens in the Industrial Revolution is people get more socially stratified. You have people at the top who are making lots and lots of money, and then at the bottom you have people working really hard. Essentially what the French Revolution tried to overthrow happens again under the Industrial Revolution. Some people tried to say that this was the natural state of things, and some people were suited for working in management or as doctors, and other people were basically had evolved to work as low-wage workers. This idea is coined by a guy named Herbert Spencer, and it was called natural selection, or excuse me, it was called social Darwinism. And it basically took Darwin's idea of natural selection and it applied it to the capitalist system. And it meant that basically it was an excuse for workers to be abused by their management. Social Darwinism said that the fittest were management and the least fit would be workers, or they had adapted to that kind of environment. Now, this brings us to our next big figure. So Karl Marx essentially said that this couldn't last, and that people at the bottom would eventually need food and would do what they needed to do to overthrow the people at the top. This idea of historical materialism is this idea that human behaviors essentially determined by their need to acquire things to survive, like food and resources and fuels. And this matters because Marx was essentially saying that the wealthy would never be able to give up the means to produce on their own. That people basically were selfish and wanted to acquire material goods, and so the wealthy would never pay the workers better just on their own. And so that's always going to lead to class conflicts, the wealthy versus the poor. And what he advocated for was violent social revolution. Basically, that the poor had to overthrow the wealthy and set up a new system. He created this idea of socialism. And socialism doesn't have to be violent. Marx thought that you could only set up socialism if you had a violent revolution, which actually turned out not, well, it didn't always turn out to be the case. And socialism was you use money to try and reduce the inequality of people. So the government would tax the wealthiest and spread out that money to the poorest. And what this meant was that in socialism, the government can often own resources in manufacturing, or at least tries to control it. So it's not laissez-faire capitalism. The government is stepping in and doing things to the businesses. The idea is that in capitalism, the social benefit is that you're creating innovation and better products and better ideas, where in socialism, you're just redistributing wealth. That's your goal. In capitalism, the incentive for businesses is personal profit, whereas in socialism, the incentive for businesses is kind of long-term community health. In capitalism, you largely have an unequal society, whereas in socialism, you're trying to make an equal society. Now, socialism is not a perfect system, but in many ways, it's kind of a necessary update of the system that was created by the Industrial Revolution. So again, we have Karl Marx, who is advocating for redistributing wealth, versus Adam Smith, who says capitalism is fine, you just need to look out for yourself and society will be okay. So these two systems, capitalism and socialism, really evolve out of the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism had been around before that, but capitalism really changed under the Industrial Revolution. And through the 20th century, these two things are going to basically clash with one another, either peacefully in countries that are trying to decide how to set up their economy, and violently in wars where people are fighting between capitalists and socialists or communists. All right.